And unlike my two precocious friends here, Tom and Anthony, who were precocious children at the age of 10, I was a little bit more mature, chronologically speaking. I was 30 years ago. Oh, sorry, that's my presentation for Liars Anonymous. I was not 30, I was not 40. Anyway, I'm still standing, so who cares? There are a number of ways in which I thought about sort of recapping and retelling the story of Black Creek from its inception to its present status and present state. One way is the way we used to probably learn history in school, and a whole bunch of dates and a whole bunch of events, and this happened there, and this person attended this, and it happened in 1820, you know, all the dates, and most of us didn't learn much about history that way. I also thought that a better way might be to provide what I used to call, when I was in a different position, called a natural history of a research project. I don't view Black Creek as a research project, but the whole idea of trying to provide some context, some narrative to who you are and from whence you came. So I'm going to do it a little differently than just a bunch of dates. In fact, probably won't mention any dates at all. Now, when Cheryl contacted me and asked if I would have some comments to you about the early years, I thought, what a daunting task. How am I going to truly summarize, in my case, 22 years of an organizational's history in front of a large group of people? How can I do that in a mere 3.5 hours? I woke some of you up, right? Anyway, I have to put my glasses on because the ad-libbing stops. So. Here's the short version of the inception and the creation and the beginnings, sounds biblical, of Black Creek Community Health Center. This is the short version. In May 1989, the then Provincial Minister of Health, Eleanor Kaplan, sent a letter to the coordinating committee of the Downsview community, which would later become the first board of directors for Black Creek, and it was approval of the proposal for a community health center in the Downsview area. Now, Black Creek was not the original name. And the original name actually had Downsview. I can't remember, anybody remember, but it was an awful name. Really, no, it sounded more like a drugstore. It really didn't, but Black Creek, the only interesting thing about Black Creek, for my colleagues who had CHCs in rural areas, they thought when they first heard about Black Creek that somewhere we were in the Muskokas, we were up north, we're near Thunder Bay, and because the name suggests that you're in some different environment than we were. So 89, first date, I said I wouldn't think. The letter comes out, the board is very, very happy to get going. They put advertisements in the newspapers. My wife saw it, she gave it to me, and she said, you know, this looks like something you would enjoy. I applied, I got my first interview for reasons that I don't know, but I do appreciate. They called me back for a second interview. And in August of the same year, 89, I started as the first staff member of Black Creek Community Health Center. Let's face it, the rest is history, right? Now, there are a few gaps that need to be filled in, of course, and it's important that they are. When I looked at some of the materials, and there were tons, this was an anthropologist's dream. So any of you who were trained in the social sciences, particularly in anthropology, where field work was really important, and you always took field notes, there were tons of material that were rich in detail about what was happening and why it happened. And I noticed that what the ministry had said about the proposal, and I'll tell you why it was interesting that they would say anything, given that they weren't very cooperative at the time, was that I would describe it as an 8-year overnight success story. Because this community, And the people, and believe me, there were many people from different parts, from the community-based organizations, from some people from the government, people who were from York University, people from an organization that no longer exists, and some of you may be aware of, called NIAC. I think it was a North York Interagency Community Council, took a leading role. And it was interesting that they worked and they worked and they worked for 8 years from the first time that they started talking about and listening to people in this community about forming a community health center. Also richly detailed was examples of how community mobilization works. And this community and this organization has a rich history in mobilizing community. It also showed excellent examples of community development. And believe me, for those who work in community development, if you're new to this field, looking back and understanding how the community development process worked would be a master class, better than anything you probably have in a classroom environment. There was much interagency collaboration, but I have to tell you, and I know this for a fact, there was no collusion. That joke worked better when you're retired, you watch a lot of CNN. No collusion. Anyway, what was interesting about the development of this proposal, unlike a few years later, the ministry provided no funding whatsoever for the community organizing group to hire a consultant. So the consultants later on would do a lot of the legwork. They would organize, they would hold meetings and all. They would do the organizational work, and ultimately they would write the proposal, in concert with, in conjunction with the community group. But they took the lead. Now, it would have been nice to have had more support from the ministry at the time, especially financial. But I honestly believe that the reason why this organization became what it became was because it was forced, I put that in quotation marks, it was forced to carry out all this work, the door-to-door work, the meetings, stopping, talking to people, asking, listening. That was all done by various members, not only of community-based agency in the Jane and Finch area, but by individuals who came. People from different parts of the community, people even from outside the community. When the ministry asked for proposals, there were two requirements that had to be met. One was, and they make sense, one was, does this community need a community health center? Remember, it wasn't just opening up another medical office or even opening up a small hospital. This is something quite different. But to its credit, because that's a logical thing to ask for, but to its credit, the ministry required this. If you can show that there's a need, now you have to show that people want it. And I thought, this sounds trite to you, but having dealt with the ministry for 22 years, I thought that was one of the most remarkable things that the ministry came up with. And I mean that with all degree of seriousness. Do they want it? So, you can create all sorts of things. And if you don't know more than just in your heart and in your head that people are going to want that, it's almost useless to spend all the effort. So the first part, did this community need one? And here's where Tom mentioned public health. And I don't want to go into that because it's very sad. At the time, public health was so different. Our public health nurses went door to door. They did the new baby care. They went into people's homes. They provided mental health services, consultations, just talking with people. They were in the schools. But the one advantage for addressing if the community needed a community health center was the epidemiologist at North York Public Health. I think his last name was Johnson, Dr. Johnson. He was terrific. And what he and others did was to show what I would call the medical geography of the Jane and Finch community. So if you think of a map, and you wanted to find the individual pieces that represented the incidence and prevalence of certain diseases, does this, in any community, have high rates of chronic disease, for example, like diabetes? Because if you have those high rates, or abnormally low rates of certain things, or mostly on the high end, what about birth weights? Are birth weights normal? Are they abnormally low? In an epidemiologic sense, in a clinical sense, in a planning sense, that tells you something really important, because these are needs that have to be addressed. So North York Public Health, particularly Dr. Johnson and his team, were extremely instrumental in helping the community organizing group put together the medical geography. But now you wanted to put that overlay of something that we might call the community socio-cultural profile. And here's where many agencies in the community who had rich experience, rich knowledge, rich talent, helped this organizing group say, this is what we look like. You know, we're not just X number of people with diabetes, as important as it is, but here's where we are culturally. And you looked at census tracts, and it sounds boring, and it sounds, most of the time it is actually. But you look at that, and it tells you something really important. For example, what is a household income, an average household income in this community? Because we know that income and health are extremely related, and it must be taken into account. What about family composition? Are there first and second generations living together? Are there one-parent families? All these things will tell you a great deal about what the community looks like. You overlay that with the medical geography of the community, and that becomes the basis from which you develop your proposal. Now, the whole idea of having confirmed that the community wanted this community health center, again, involved legwork, not consultants, individuals, again, not mine. We've got this idea. You know, we've been talking to people about it. What do you think of the idea? You like it? You don't like it? How would you change it? What do you think we need most in this community? And that took well over a year to do. Once that proposal was accepted and funding was provided, the coordinating committee had a very interesting and challenging task ahead of them. It was hiring an executive director. Now this isn't the Cary Milner story. It really has something to do with me, I guess, but more importantly, you have to go back in time where you now have an organization. You literally have a baby that was just born. You have a place to put your baby, but it's totally unready and unready for service to the community. And you have to hire somebody. It's not just that you don't know who that somebody is as a person and what he or she has done, but you have no history as an organization. You can't go back and say, where were our successes? Where were the gaps? Where were the weaknesses? There was nothing. So when they were out looking for an executive director, it was very important that they convey, not just to listen, but they convey, what they were looking for. That was a representation of 8 years of struggle, really, to get this proposal accepted. The first interview was at the Jane Finch Community and Family Center, and I always say that because I still laugh. It was after, I think it was around 7:30 at night, so the center was essentially closed, and I met with, I believe it was three people, two of whom would end up being on the board eventually. And they met in an area that was for childcare. So we sat on these little tiny chairs, and little did they know, because my wife had been involved in early childhood education, and she had been a kindergarten teacher, I was used to saying, God help me, if that were today, if I were interviewing for a job, you'd have to hire a crane to get me up. Well, in that interview, what was interesting, it was more conversational. It wasn't like, here's a scenario, what would you do? It was, we talked. It was conversational. And I learned more from listening to them than they perhaps listened or learned from me. That was followed up by a second interview that was at the Red Cross office that used to be on Keel, about 6 or 7 blocks east of, on Finch, 6 or 7 blocks east of Keel. And I got to the interview about an hour early, and I was knocking on the door, and nobody answered, and I thought, this is like from a Mel Brooks movie, I show up for an interview, that's the good news, the bad news is I'm probably at the wrong place. Finally, the door opens, and this person doesn't look very happy and just looks at me and says, this is a fire door. And I was going to say, if I knew that, I wouldn't be pounding like an idiot for the last half hour. I went in and I sat down, and they opened a very small room, and another candidate for the position came out. And this person was impeccably dressed. And not only was she impeccably dressed, but she had not a briefcase, but an attaché bag. So this is,
Yeah.
And here I guess, my wife said I had to borrow a tie. So I thought, if it looks better, I'm dead. I went into the room, and from that point on, and by the way, there was a newborn, and that told me something about this community. There was a newborn, she was 2 weeks old, asked very good questions, and that's where Jane and Finch, what do you expect? What I learned was that they were looking for somebody who would invest time and energy in carrying out 3 important principles. Commitment to the community and commitment to the organization. Service focused and respect. Now they didn't say those in order. There wasn't a slide, but you could tell that these were the 3 core principles that not only would be the beginning of this community health center, but ones that would be followed, and I'm sure are followed today, very religiously. The one question that they really wanted to ask me in a very direct way was prefaced with this. We had just talked about the diversity of the Jane and Finch community and what that meant to me, and how did I see that as somebody who came from the social sciences and all that kind of stuff. And then they said, well, how about this, a diverse community, people have different beliefs. And I said, are you asking me if I get along with people? Because that was very important to them. If you're going to have an organization that is respectful and is service-driven, you want to make sure that the person, and not only the person who is the executive director, but all staff and board and volunteers and students. And I said, you know what, I can honestly tell you that throughout my whole adult years, I remember I was 30 or 40 or maybe 45 at the time, I said, if I had to write down the names of those people that I did not get along with, and I was deadly serious here, I said the list would be, fortunately, I hope, the list would be very small. And they seemed relieved, and I said, but truth be told, it would be very memorable. So I can only imagine that after 22 years as the executive director, I must be on a whole bunch of people's lists right now, but I must tell you, some of them are on mine as well. My mother asked a question that would, I'm not just saying this because of Mother's Day, and unfortunately my mother passed away, but that doesn't take away the important question that she asked me. When I called her and my dad, and they lived in the States, to tell them that I was overjoyed to have been offered the position, my dad's on the extension phone, and my mother said, wow, the executive director of a community health center. Wow. I just had one question. What is a community health center? And you know what? God love her. Before it was relatively easy. My brother's an academic, I was an academic. My sister was an educational psychologist, later a nurse. Those are pretty easy. But this one, But you didn't say it like, ooh, you know, what's he getting himself into? It was just, what is a community health center? And you know, as I say, that question, even to this day, and listening to Adriana, it's something that if you stop asking yourself that question, you're in deep trouble. Because times have changed, environments have changed, pretty much everything else has changed. So I never answered her because she was satisfied that I was very happy, and I was to have this opportunity.